As I was praying this week with the gospel and was thinking about the story of these tenants, it got me thinking about the times in my life that I've been a tenant. Have you? Have you ever been a renter in where you live? I took the opportunity to count up how many places I have rented, how many times I've been a tenant, and it turns out the number is 8. One of the most memorable ones was the year that I got to spend living right on the ocean, north of Boston, in a town called Revere. Right on the ocean. I'm not even exaggerating. I looked right at it. A friend of mine became my roommate, my friend Jeff, who now lives in Maine, and we had a great time. And one of the real perks of living there was the great landlords. We had old Italian married couple that had lived in the house for years, Anna and Arthur. But because they were from Boston, they called her Anner and him Arthur. And you won't believe, based on what I've told you so far, that they wound up evicting us. It's the one time I've ever been evicted. And if in this story, if my side of the street was completely clean, I probably would tell you all the details. But since I've got my own baggage with that story, I'll save it for another day. But I found myself thinking, how could they? How could they throw us out? And the answer is easy. They're the landlords, and we were the tenants. If they didn't like something, they didn't have to think too long about it. They had the power. There's something great about being a tenant. You get to have flexibility in where you live. You get to move every year if you want. It's one of the reasons why I lived so many places. But if you are a tenant, you have to live by other people's rules. Here's where I got tricked, though. Jeff and I got along great with Anna and Arthur. They loved us. Several times Anna said, "You're like my sons." If she wound up getting a 2-for-1 deal at the grocery store, we usually wound up with the other of whatever it was that she bought. So we started to get a false sense of security. We started to be like the people in this gospel today. Maybe we'll get the inheritance now. But no. All it took was one conflict, not even a very big one, and we were out. So because we were given this parable today, imagine if we look at it in a new way. What if Jesus were to say to us the way he said to them, "Hear now another parable." Imagine that there is a divine Father who decides to create a beautiful planet and divides it between ocean and land and fills the oceans with fish and sea life and fills the land with beauty. There's mountains and there's valleys and there's fertile fields. And imagine then if God leases it to tenants and says, "Take care of this. This is mine, but I want to share it with you. All I ask is that you take care of it." I ask you, what will happen to those tenants if they abuse it? What happens to those tenants if they don't care for it the way they were intended? If they ignore the messengers who come to remind them to care for what is not theirs, but is God's? What would happen? Well, I can tell you as someone who has been evicted, sometimes the consequences are strong. Now, we might say, wait a minute, this parable doesn't work because God is love. God is unconditional love. So how could God ever throw us out? But that's really not the definition of unconditional love. Unconditional love doesn't mean unconditional acceptance of someone's behavior without any boundaries or consequences. God can love us unconditionally and still tell us no. That's what tough love is. If unconditional love meant you could do whatever you wanted without consequences, then kids could just steal from their parents forever. And you could treat the people in your life that you love however you wanted, because they would just be obligated to always take more. So we have to listen as we hear Jesus saying in this parable, the kingdom of God is being taken away from you, and it's going to be given to people who don't abuse it. And it strikes me that this is a message that is really important for us right now, especially in light of some of the conversations I've had with people this year. Here's an example of a conversation that has just become commonplace. Strawberries don't taste like anything anymore. Strawberries don't taste, the texture's right, but they don't taste like strawberries. They taste like water. They taste like, you buy them, they're all red, but they don't taste right. The same thing I hear about tomatoes all the time. They don't taste like anything. We're noticing that things are kind of kerflooey. Nowadays, July and June feel kind of like October, and September and October feel like July. And every single time we have a hurricane now, it breaks all the records. Every single one. A hurricane of the century again, hurricane of the century a week later, hurricane of the century right after that. Something's going on. Something's not right. The messengers are coming. We are in a dangerous place because as the messengers come, as the strawberries don't taste right, and then we try to get over that, and then we notice the tomatoes aren't right, and then we notice the harvest has gotten all funny, and then we notice that the months aren't acting right, and then we notice that every time a hurricane comes, everything breaks loose. We are being given messages. And they were subtle at first, but they're getting stronger, and we need to listen because we are, as they say down south, fixing to get evicted. And we do not want to get evicted from this planet. I feel a special obligation to pay attention to this because of the day I was born. Through no choice of my own, I was born on Earth Day. And so there has always been kind of a fire in me about this. But it seems very clear that this time, as this reading comes around, we are meant to listen and to ask, what is my role now in this? How can I be a better tenant? We live in very sacred land here in upstate New York because it was first inhabited by the Iroquois Nation, who are a fascinating band of Native Americans. Their practices are very beautiful. One of them was this: whenever they would have to make a decision as an Iroquois nation, they had a rule for how to make it. They had to consider how that decision would affect the 7th generation from right now. So 7th generation means you have to ask, whatever we do right now, how will this impact our grandchildren's grandchildren's kids? That's what 7 generations is. Grandchildren's grandchildren's kids. And if the answer was, it will hurt them, then you can't do it. You can't do something that's going to hurt your grandchildren's grandchildren's kids. That's irresponsible. And maybe now you've seen that brand of kitchen and household goods supply that you'll find in the grocery store, 7th generation. That's what they're evoking there. We have to buy things that remind us that we are responsible for the 7th generation from now. The Pope before our current Pope, Pope Benedict, was the first one to write about this in a spiritual way. Pope Emeritus Benedict wrote about 10 years ago, all of us need to recognize that this care for the earth requires a spiritual awakening. He said, it requires us not to recognize just our churches as God's home, but everywhere as God's home, because God is the one who made it, and God owns it. And this is what he said. Here's his quote. If you listen to your heart, you will know that the earth belongs to God, and that holiness requires us to love and care for the earth. And we need to give him credit because while he was Pope, he made Vatican City the first nation on earth to be completely carbon neutral. What he did was he bought a bunch of forest in the Balkans to offset whatever pollution was being created by the buildings in Vatican City. And now it is 100% carbon neutral and has been since 2011. Now we might say, what can I do? I can't buy a forest in the Balkans. But as I was driving up here today, it's very clear by the debris on the side of 9W that a lot of us aren't really working that hard at this. We're not worried enough about it. We haven't let the strawberries be a strong enough message to us, or the tomatoes. We haven't let the weird summer or the terrible storms be enough of a message. I don't want to tell you what the year was like after Anna and Arthur evicted me. I'll suffice it to say I lived in 3 different places in the course of that next 12 months because I could not get my act together. Being evicted is not pretty. let's not do it.